Hello there and welcome. I'm Ole Brøgger, and if you're new here, I really hope I will earn your subscription today. This is part 1 and I don't know how many parts this is going to be, but we are going to build a boat, and not just any boat. I have built a huge boat before, but this time I'm gonna make a bit smaller boat. And maybe it's not a boat, it's an airship, because I want to build a fantasy airship with a blimp and all that stuff. The primary material will be this foam from the army painter that is very difficult to source. And to lift up the boat, I have this acrylic rod that I will make something for a base. So first, we need to build the hull. Let's get started. I want to build this ship like a real ship was built in the old days, like with a keel and frames and stems and all that stuff. And I knew that I would start out with the keel. I cut it out of XPS foam from the army painter, and I made a strip that was 1 by 1 centimeter and about 38 centimeters long or 15 inches. I used a miniature to make some measurements and see how tall the hull would be from the keel to the top of the hull. I started to freehand some drawings on the foam and cut out the stem on my Proxon. It looked pretty well, so I continued making the back part of the boat, and I also cut out some of the framing, and there was a lot of stuff going on in my head, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to make a boat that actually looks a bit nice, I have to do something else. So I ended up scrapping everything except for the keel. I went into Inkscape. I made a design of all the framing, the stem and the keel and the stern. I sent the drawings to my laser cutter. My laser cutter is very hard on the foam, and this is 1 centimeter thick, and the laser cutter can easily cut through this thickness. The problem is it's making a too wide cut. It melts too much foam, so it took a lot of attempts. I found some good settings, but the laser didn't cut it all the way through, and that was okay, and I could just cut the rest with a knife. And this was definitely a lot better than my previous attempt doing it freehand. Now it has the right shape, everything is straight. Now I just need to cut out all the frames, clean it up and sand everything, and put some texture on the inside where the frame will be visible. I want it to look like wood, so I used a tiny wire brush. Using a wire brush is a very effective way to make wood texture if you have a lot of area to cover, instead of using a pencil and draw every little vein in the wood by hand. All the framing is done. Now we just need to glue everything together. And for this, I will use hot glue. And when working with thin parts like this foam, it is very difficult to use PVA glue because I would need some pin needles to hold everything together, and my patience is not good with that. So hot glue it is. It will make a bit of a mess that needs to be cleaned up later. I can live with that as long as it is speeding up my building progress. And I think this starts to take shape. It actually looks like the frame for a hull to a boat. But comparing the size to a miniature, I really need to shave some of the framing down, because this frame is too tall if I want to maintain the playability on the interior. So I will have to cut down at least 2 inches of the frame. This is a lot better, and I think it still looks like the frame for a boat. And the playability, that's intact too. And now I will need to make some planks. I will start out making some planks that are 5 millimeters thick. But before I cut it, I will use my wire brush to make some wooden texture. This is a lot easier on a big chunk of foam instead of a flimsy thin piece. It actually took up a lot of foam cutting out the frame for the boat, so I could use some parts of it for planks. But I think 5mm were a bit too thick, so I will use those in the bottom. And I also cut up some 3mm thickness, and I will use them for the top part of the hull. And again, I'll attach everything with hot glue, and I might have to do some cleanup later. The 5mm planks were pretty easy to mount, and they had some sort of flexibility, but the 3mm, they were a lot easier to work with, and they were nice and soft, and I could easily bend them into shape and glue them in. I thought the front of the boat were pretty difficult to make, but it was actually pretty easy. The back of the boat, on the other hand, was a bit more difficult. Maybe I should have added another frame for the back, because it was very bendy and flexible and it was very difficult to control it. I also had to trim the back of the boat because it was lifting it up a bit and I needed a straight deck, so I had to straighten everything out. And now it starts to look like a hull of a ship. Now let's build that deck. I took a piece of scrap foam that were in the correct size, so I will start with making the front. And as you can see, it's one of the pieces that were through the laser cutter where I didn't use the frame part. But it doesn't matter, it will be covered up by some coffee stir sticks that will cover the full deck when this is done. I'll use some of the 3mm planks that I cut earlier as a cover to make a better transition between the deck and the hull. I will make the deck in 3 parts, so one that will have the front castle, a mid part with a deck hatch, and then we will have the back part where we will have the helm and the engine. On the back side of the boat, I'll have to fix what we call the stern. And I think I will just cut out a couple of pieces of my planks and glue them in. And finally, I'll need to clean up the outside of the hull. I will just trim it down so the planks will be a bit more smoother and the same height because there were variations while I was adding them to the frame. But I will trim everything down, remove the excess glue, and this is a lot of work. I think I spent about 3 hours cleaning everything up, scratching it with the wire brush to make some more wooden textures. I'll need to clean up the desk and then we can start all over again on the inside of the boat. And here I'm pretty glad that I already made the texture on the planks. And I found out it was pretty easy with a side cutter to cut out the excess hot glue. I spent about an hour cleaning up all the hot glue and now I'll need to make 2 bulkheads, one in the front and one in the back. And it was pretty easy to get the right sizes of the bulkheads because I already had the cutouts from the frames and they would fit perfectly inside the ship. I just had to trim it down to the right size and there you are, it fit. However, there is one problem. There is holes from the cutouts, so I can only use them for templates, but it's okay. I can still use some of the leftover cutoffs if I just mingle it a bit around and then I can draw around it and cut them out to the right size. And now we start to have something that we can call a bulkhead. The bulkhead will also need doors, and I found these laser cuts in my pile and they were not cut all the way through. But I think I don't want to use the frame for these, so the doors will actually work perfectly. I just cut the frames off on my mini saw and I had to watch my fingers because this is something that's tiny and my fingers were pretty close to that blade. They also needed a bit of sanding. I actually had 2 sets of opposite looking doors and that was perfect because then I could glue them together and get the pattern on both sides. A bit more sanding, and then I could make a cutout in the bulkhead. I could just use the door as a template on my Proxon. These doors are cut out of 3mm plywood, but I want the bulkheads to be the same thickness as these, actually fat doors because I glued 2 of them together. I used a door to adjust the Proxon, and then I could cut all the way through the bulkhead to get it the same thickness. And this actually starts to look good. I like the thickness of these bulkheads, but I will still need to make them look like something made out of wood. So I will just scorch it with a knife and highlight it with a pencil and finally scratch it with my wire brush. And now it actually looks useful. Just need to do the other side and the other bulkhead. Now both bulkheads are done and I will glue them in with some hot glue. I'll just keep the doors as a press fit. It's a lot easier during gameplay that I can just remove the door. And I actually think it turned out pretty good. I will need to do a couple of holes here as a preparation for something we are going to have a look at in part 2. I'll just poke a hole with a round pointy file. It actually had the perfect diameter for this hole. And I think these deck plates are a bit too thick. It looks a bit bulky. So I'll try to thin them down and I will use my Proxxon to do that. And that was pretty easy doing with the bow of the boat. But the two other deck plates, not so good. My Proxxon is not tall enough to slice through these plates. So I had to split them in two parts, and for that I used a ruler as a guide, so I would get a straight line through the deck. And then it was pretty easy to slice the deck. And glue the two parts together again. I cut out a piece of foam so I could reinforce the cuts so it wouldn't break so easily. And I think this helped a lot. And when this is covered up with some coffee stir stick as a deck, I think it's gonna look awesome. I think I will do some etching all around the lines here on the boat to indicate where the walls and railing are going to be. And for that I will cut out a 5 by 5 millimeter strip and put all around the edges and where the doors and rooms are going to be. Now I will need to make a base for this flying ship, and I cut out 2 pieces of plywood that were 6 millimeters thick. And then I have this acrylic rod that will be used to lift up the ship. But I will need to poke a couple of holes in the bottom of the ship to pass the rod through. I just made a hole all the way through because the flooring in the bottom of the ship will stop the rod from penetrating all the way through. I will cut 2 pieces of the rod that are 12 centimeters long, that's approximately 4.5 inches. And then drill 2 holes in the base for the rods to pass through. I won't glue the rods in before I'm done painting everything because I don't want paint on these transparent rods. However, I will glue the 2 pieces of plywood together. It's not that important. I'm going to cover everything up with some foam. The plywood is only to add some weight to the base and secure the rods, because I want to make sure that it's sturdy and heavy enough since it's going to carry the full weight of the ship. And while I wait for the glue to dry on the base, I will apply some Mod Podge on the outside of the hull. This will bind everything together, and at the same time it will also work as a primer. You can paint directly on foam, but it will suck up a lot of the paint and you will have to paint it over a couple of times. And that's why I put some black paint into my Mod Podge. I also gave the bottom of the deck plates a good layer of Mod Podge. It won't be visible, but if you turn the deck plate around, you can still see the bottom of it, and I don't like that it's white. I've cut out some pieces of foam that I will wrap around the piece of plywood that will be used for the base. And then we will need some electronics. I have these balloon lights that will flash in random colors, and then I have a multicolored fairy light. I'm not installing these lights just yet. I will just use these battery boxes to make room so I can glue them in later. I will poke some holes in the foam so they will match the holes in the plywood. And before I attach the foam to the plywood, I will make sure that the acrylic rod will match the holes. Some hot glue on the plywood and I can attach the first piece of foam. I made sure there was no glue on the acrylic rods. I'll just use them to line up the foam to the plywood. I will also poke 2 holes here. This is to put the wires from the battery boxes to the top of the base plate. I'll just test to make sure that the fairy light can pass through the hole, and it works. This piece of plywood will be wrapped in foam, And then I will trim it down on my Proxon so it will look nice and even all around. I'll use some sandpaper to smooth everything out and round the corners. And finally I will give it a good layer of Mod Podge with black paint. And now the outside of the boat is dry, I can start giving it some Mod Podge on the inside. I'll also give the hull a primer. I'll use this Dungeon and Subterrane from the Army Painter. This has a very nice brown greenish color, and I think it will be a very good color for the base coat of something that should look like wood. I actually spent a lot of hours just building this part, and I really love how everything turned out. We have something here that looks like the hull of a ship and the beginning of a larger boat. In the next videos we will focus on the front and the back of the ship. I will need to build a cargo bay, we will put some planks, and if there is time for it, I will also build the engine room. If you want to see more on how this turns out and you think I've earned it, hit that subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment below on if you have any ideas on what you think I should do with the rest of this build. I will be working on this, so not everything will be there, but we still have a couple of episodes to do, so maybe we can change it during the builds. This is it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.